Hi, everybody. Is that too loud? I usually don't need a mic because I'm really loud. I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight to hear about the material elements of enslaved people's mobility, the way to freedom. I'm Paul Robbins. I'm Dean of the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And thank you for joining us for tonight's lecture. It's really exciting to be back in person. I know a lot of people are still hiding. I'm kind of in the high-risk category because I just wanted to be back in person with people, and I have loved every minute of being able to see live lectures with human beings in good fellowship and learn together. So I'm super happy to be here, and hopefully everybody stays healthy. When I first came across Dr. Hyman, I was on Twitter. That's how it happened. And there were all these pictures of birds, exquisite pictures of birds. I'm like, ooh, and ah. And I was just struck. And then I'm like, who is this? And then I found out she's a geographer like me. And then I started looking up her work. And I thought, this is Nelson people. This is University of Wisconsin Nelson Institute people. The work is incredibly compelling. It is challenging. It is about social justice. Some of the darkest and brightest parts of history in North America, and nature, fundamentally about the material conditions. It is about nature. I don't know, everybody else had a material turn in the social sciences. I can tell you, I never left the material. And I really appreciate that about Dr. Hyman's work. And we thought it would be a great fit for Everyone's Earth, which is our series on conversations on race and the environment. The environmental movement, which has done obviously so much work in my lifetime to transform, preserve, and save nature, has been somewhat limited in its reach when it comes to broader and more diverse publics. That's just how it is. And it's something that we have to own up to. Too many communities have not been included in setting the agenda, the environmental agenda, in securing educational opportunities, and finding jobs in leadership positions in environmental professions and organizations. I won't read you the statistics, but I'm here to tell you they're embarrassing and problematic. Even outdoor recreation, like the environmental movement, has been overwhelmingly white and middle class. That is changing, and it's a good thing. So it's Nelson's hope to get at those issues and ignite a conversation. We hope that our Everyone's Earth lecture series helps raise awareness around issues and opportunities related to diversity and inclusion across the environmental spectrum, and I know that tonight's lecture will do that. Before I go further with introductions, I'd like to take a moment, as a result, to acknowledge that the University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejope since time immemorial. We acknowledge the attempted forced removal of the Ho-Chunk people and honor their legacy of resistance and resilience. The history of colonization informs our work and our vision for a more collaborative future. We recognize and respect the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation and of the other 11 nations, First Nations, within the boundaries of the state now known as Wisconsin. Now I'd just like to thank the partners for the event. We got good partners tonight. They are the Nelson Institute Office of Environmental Justice, the Nelson Institute Community Environmental Scholars Program, the Nelson Institute Center for Culture, History, and Environment, the Department of African American Studies, the Department of Geography, the Department of Geoscience, and the Center for the Humanities. There's a lot of interest in work of this kind. We're grateful for their partnership, and they each deserve our collective thanks. And now I get to introduce Monica White, and she gets to do everything from here on. Professor Monica White will formally introduce our speaker tonight and moderate the question and answer session at the end of the lecture, for which we will have time for people to kind of ask questions and talk to Dr. Hyman. Professor White is Associate Professor of Environmental Justice, and her tenure line is split between the Department of Community and Environmental Sociology and the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. She is also the Gaylord Nelson Distinguished Chair in Integrated Environmental Studies and the Director of Nelson Institute's Office of Environmental Justice. The Nelson Institute's Office of Environmental Justice oversees an inclusive community of scholars who share a passion for working towards creating a fair, just, resilient, and sustainable world. Initiatives such as our Community Environmental Scholars Program, the University Year Program, and the Native Nations Partnership Program all provide opportunities for faculty and students to work with community partners to gain a better understanding of the causes and consequences of environmental justice problems and to collaborate to address them. Monica, we are very lucky to have you, and thank you for your service and leadership. Dr. Monica White.
Thank you, Paul. Like you, I'm a fan, a Twitter fan and follower of Dr. Hyman's. Welcome, everyone. I am so pleased to introduce Professor Christy Hyman. Dr. Hyman is Assistant Professor of Human Geography in the Department of Geosciences at Mississippi State University. She is a digital humanist, environmental advocate, and grief worker with a PhD in geography from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. In addition to all of this, Dr. Hyman is also the Southeast Division Director of the American Association of Geographers Rural Geography Specialty Group, all caps, and Communications Director for the American Association of Geographers Black Geographies Specialty Group. Dr. Hyman's research focuses on African American efforts toward cultural and political assertion in the Great Dismal Swamp region during the antebellum era. In addition, her work focuses on the attendant social and environmental costs of human landscape resource exploitation, utilizing geographic information systems to observe human experience while simultaneously acknowledging phenomena deriving from oppressive systems in society, especially those that threaten sustainable futures. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Christy Hyman.
Seems to not be mirroring. So let's get it mirrored again. All right, thank you so much, everyone, for finding time to come and be here with us tonight. I'm going to move through this presentation, and it's going to be multimedia based. And so as I scroll down and move through here, we will begin with a video. Now, my foray into recovering African Americans' tarnished lineages to the Great Dismal Swamp in its landscape, it necessitated that I immerse myself in the contested interpretations of African descendant ties to the land and how those ties mattered in marking sites of memory in the swamp. The Great Dismal Swamp, located along the North Carolina-Virginia border, was a haven for enslaved fugitives historically. Yet there are, well, at that time in 2017, no physical sites that mark that revolutionary action of self-liberation. And so I began to recover that erasure through using digital media, and I created a short video that sought to capture the moments of fear, of dread, and hope in the process of enslaved flight. So. It looks like the sound is not registering. Is it something that we need to do on this end, or? Sorry, everybody.
people used to like to say, ziyawa. Directly translated, it means it's falling, but the correct translation is, man, if a party's like banging, you know, you'll be like, ziyawa.
So I screened this first iteration of that video at Digital Humanities 2017, and it inspired within me a continuous probing of the connection among the aesthetics of Black culture, shared power and authority, and the many publics that the Black digital work engages. The video is an artifact grounded in Black digital humanities recovery over. It is a multi-dominant audiovisual meditation on enslaved flight and the pursuit of freedom. Multi-dominance is a term that originated with artist and critic Robert L. Douglas, and it seeks to formalize a Black aesthetic, synthesized visual musical elements invoking a trans-African culture. Composer George E. Lewis informs us that Douglas's aesthetic of multi-dominance involves multiple use of colors and intense degrees of textures, design patterns, and shapes. My video, for instance, evokes a tableau of still images, motion picture, and text, representing a range of sites within the Great Dismal Swamp that coalesce into a whole, comprising trauma, struggle, creative expression, and the pursuit of freedom, which is continually ongoing. When we think back to the plantation landscape of a site of domination and trauma, we also have to think to the way that enslaved people made music for themselves. And it was quite different than the minstrelsy spectacle forced on enslaved people for their enslavers' enjoyment. Enslaved people's musical performance, while under the coercion of enslavement, constitute what historian Katrina D. Thompson has called contradictory pieces of stagecraft, done for the colonial gaze, yet still a signification of resistance, power, and cultural autonomy. Where enslaved people's creative expression pleased themselves, provided even greater opportunity. As historian John Cruz points out, slave owners may have only heard noise from enslaved cabins, yet such a dismissive notion of the music enslaved people made for themselves was tantamount to being oblivious to the structures of meaning that anchored the soundings of the hermeneutic world of the enslaved people. To hear only noise is to remain removed from how enslaved soundings probed their circumstances and cultivated histories of memories. My goal in making the video was rooted in getting closer to visualizing those soundings and memories formed from enslaved people's committed yearning for freedom. This process of curating the images and text for the video also built my understanding of the importance of engaging recovery work with descendant communities living near the Great Dismal Swamp today. It's digital recovery aimed at creating a usable past that will empower living descendants with pride in their shared freedom struggles. The recovery efforts in the Great Dismal Swamp, they highlight heritage projects that reveal opportunities to contribute to the existing cultural heritage resilience that continues to persist. Enslaved people laboring in the Great Dismal Swamp were well acquainted with the sights and sounds of the night. Nighttime movements meant an increase in vision through the scenes of the night. In this, enslaved people's senses were sharpened. They could utilize their night vision to help them see without disturbing the wildlife of the night. By day, they would acquaint themselves with animal tracks and scat to know which mammals to avoid. The swamp environment provided different ways of reading the landscape that helped to foretell a coming storm, an animal predator in the midst, and most important, the sound of the slave militia. All these occurrences on the land that enslaved people reckoned with provide a multilayered view that the contested space of the Great Dismal Swamp represents. These contested spaces, bound up with multiple meanings, reveal a positionality that distinguish enslaver from enslaved. Where an enslaver saw a dwelling that provided enslaved shelter, the enslaved freedom seeker saw as a site of captivity, the plantation mansion. Where enslavers saw work sites, enslaved freedom seekers observed the potential for spatial reappropriation. And where enslavers saw the need to provide the enslaved with implements for the purpose of completing a task, The enslaved freedom seekers saw a resource to be lifted for life on the run. Appraising the work regimes of enslaved people in the Great Dismal Swamp, it shows the extent to how much landscape degradation contributed to a capitalist realism of place utility that exists to the present day. Place utility, seen by 19th century agriculturalists, was a means of making all areas of the land useful. But in today's terms, utility of landscape contributes to the degradation of its condition. And if you juxtapose the Great Dismal Swamp landscape modifications historically, you also can see that the landscape conditions over time show that a need to return to the landscape commons is needed. The contested space of the array of antebellum work regimes, it demonstrates that whether on small farms, large plantations, or within slavery-adjacent industries, enslaved people circumvented regimes of control in order to find freedom and refuge in the Great Dismal Swamp. These areas near the Great Dismal Swamp reveal the peril and the promise for those seeking freedom in historical geographies of containment, and enrich our understanding of the multivariate traces, social, political, and ideological, embedded in landscape, and the impacts that these meanings have had in history. It illuminates the dynamics of space and its locations in terms of key questions about the distribution of power, the construction of social and political reality within communities, and the place of marginalized individuals in society. So, as we think about these concepts and about the worlds that enslaved people made for themselves in reaction to their relations, you have to also think about their reactions to, the non-human community. And so these are some photographs of an area of the Great Dismal Swamp today that is maintained by the Friends of the Great Dismal Swamp, where they are working to create pollinator gardens and places where they can help to increase the species diversity and help those pollinators to do their meaningful and needed work out in nature. So if we think about interspecies encounter, we think about several vignettes that I was able to get from reading the testimonies of enslaved people. Moses Grandy says, "I remember 4 sisters and 4 brothers. My mother had more children, but they were dead or sold away before I can remember. I was the youngest. I remember well my mother often hid us all in the woods to prevent master selling us. When we wanted water, she sought for it in any hole or puddle formed by the falling trees or otherwise. It was often full of tadpoles and insects. She strained it and gave it round to each of us in the hollow of her hand. For food, she gathered berries in the woods, got potatoes and raw corn." In another section of his narrative, he goes, "It is not uncommon for flies to blow the sores made by flogging. In that case, we get a strong weed growing in those parts called the oak of Jerusalem. We boil it at night and wash the sores with the liquor, which is extremely bitter. On this, the creepers or maggots come out. To relieve them in some degree after severe flogging, their fellow slaves rub their backs with part of their little allowance of fat meat." Harriet Jacobs also informs us of her species and interspecies encounter. "Peter landed first, and with a large knife cut a path through bamboo and briars of all descriptions. He came back, took me in his arms, and carried me to a seat made among the bamboos. Before we reached it, we were covered with hundreds of mosquitoes. In an hour's time, they had poisoned my flesh that I was a pitiful sight to behold. As daylight increased, I saw snake after snake crawling round us. I had been accustomed to the sight of snakes all of my life, but these were larger than any I'd ever seen. To this day, I shudder when I remember that morning." So this is a temporary hideout that Harriet Jacobs is describing before she would be taken to live in her grandmother's garret for upwards of 7 years to elude slave catchers. So Peter is a family relation, and he knew how he worked on the boats as an enslaved person. And what he was able to do was go between this section of Snaky Swamp in Chowan County, North Carolina, and go back and forth until they were able to take her to her grandmother's garret. Moses Grandy tells us also, I built myself a little hut and had provisions brought to me as opportunity served. Here among snakes, bears, and panthers, whenever my strength was sufficient, I cut down a juniper tree and converted it into cooper's timber. The camp, like those commonly set up for Negroes, was entirely open on one side. On that side, a fire is lit at night, and the person sleeping puts his feet towards it. One night, I was awake by some large animal smelling my face and snuffing strongly. I felt its cold muzzle. I suddenly thrust out my arms and shouted with all my might. It was frightened and made off. I do not know whether it was a bear or a panther, but it seemed as tall as a large calf. I slept, of course, no more that night. I put my trust in the Lord and continued on the spot. I was never attacked again. So these vignettes of the encounter between enslaved people who were liberating themselves in the Great Dismal Swamp or swamp-like environments, they shed light on the ways that navigational literacy was able to influence and make way for them to have mobility to go from place to place. Clearly, in Harriet Jacobs' situation, by her being an enslaved woman, she did not have the navigational literacy that Moses Grandy had because he was an enslaved waterman expected to go up and down the canals all around the different shore ports from Norfolk all the way down to Wilmington, North Carolina. Yes, his navigational literacy was expanded, but he was also recognized. Everyone knew who he was. So his hypervisibility meant that it was extremely difficult for him to ever try to run away because he was so commonly recognized. So that's the irony between the gender dynamics of being able to flee. Harriet Jacobs needed her uncle to help her and orient her to these different places in the woods until they could find her and get her to another place. So this is where I turn to showing different assets that have to do with substantiating that the Great Dismal Swamp indeed was a place that was so filled with so many enslaved freedom seekers that they made a law. There was a law written, and it hit the books in 1847 because there were so many enslaved people hiding out in the swamp. Now, the timber industries in the swamp, what they were doing, they were complicating the legal codes that had to do with enslaved people working out there, because what they would do is they would employ enslaved freedom seekers. They just would not ask any questions. And so this law came out because of the fact that there were company superintendents who didn't ask questions about an enslaved person's whereabouts, did not pay them, but just allowed them to work and allowed them to keep camp with the rest of the enslaved people who were there, who had been rented out to these timber industries doing work in the swamp. So the process of collecting archival and geospatial assets for this work allowed me to discover the importance of cross-disciplinary exploration in locating evidence and sources related to enslaved freedom seeker experiences. I made decisions stemming from determining just how much evidence I could marshal for an informed interpretation of making meaning from non-textual products. Non-textual products are images that invoke meaning and tell a story through visual engagement with a viewer. This process allowed me to push the boundaries of how imagery helped to construct signifying elements of meaning within stories that highlighted the inherent struggle of enslaved people's experiences. I often found myself shuttling meaning from one spatial context to another in order to attempt to recreate the world that enslaved freedom seekers made. Within digital mapping enslaved freedom seekers' experience, one can amass an array of media containing meaning-making strands of the past that provide a fuller view of those marginalized from the historical record. For enslaved people seeking freedom in the Great Dismal Swamp region of eastern North Carolina, one of the first hurdles was knowing how to move through a punitive landscape within antebellum society. Enslaved freedom seekers possessed no legal identity of their own because of laws that only saw them as property in the eyes of enslavers. As properties in the eyes of the antebellum law, the enslaved person was not a person possessing autonomy or free will and could not have a legal spouse and children of their own, meaning exclusive right to their children if an enslaver decided to sell that child away, or the right to protect that child from brutal punishment. despite encouragement from enslavers to pair and then profit from the natural increase between enslaved people. So this complicated status of unfreedom made the legal process for establishing their freedom non-existent. For enslaved people engaged in flight, the knowledge of the landscape, the availability of resources, and the assistance of allies was needed if they were to make it to the Great Dismal Swamp or further north to freedom. So how did I get these sources? Where did I get them from? I got them from the digital historical collection called the Digital Library of American Slavery at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. And it contains runaway slave advertisements that highlight the obstacles involved in enslaved people seeking freedom from escape. Now, these were first compiled as a dissertation product by an African-American scholar by the name of Freddie Parker. He went to UNC Chapel Hill as a PhD student and graduated, and he then went on to become a professor at North Carolina Central University in Durham, North Carolina, which is a historically black college. He is now emeritus. But that's where those records came from, and they were digitized by Dr. Lauren Schwiniger, who was a historian at UNCG as well. And he worked with the Digital Library of American Slavery in the library portion of UNCG to make this happen. I want to remind my viewers and my audience that the enslavers authoring enslaved runaway advertisement were written to keep enslaved freedom seekers held in a system of bondage. The characterization of enslaved people in these advertisements treat enslaved freedom seekers as objects and not as human beings. I must affirm that utilizing enslaved runaway advertisements as archival evidence is not to affirm the oppressive system that allowed slavery's brutality, nor endorse the racial and gendered stereotypes that these ads suggest about African-descended people. My aim is to illuminate the committed yearning for enslaved people to liberate themselves despite slavery's cruel regime. Enslaved people were veritable beasts of burden, and the land, a canvas for profit. That was how enslaved 19th century enslavers and agriculturalists saw the world around them. Such a view of people as subhuman and the land purely as extractive has produced deleterious effects that are felt to the present day. Of course, the voices of Henry David Thoreau, John Muir, and others ushered in a social critique and movement to conserve the lands making up this earth. Economic development and industrialization, however, proved too strong an opponent, and the cries to protect the earth's resources were all but drowned out in the move to bring wealth into many regions as possible in the West. The 1960s ecological movement, headed by Rachel Carson, Dave Brower, Paul Ehrlich, and others, was the most decisive intervention in that legislative action that followed from their modes of activism. Silent Spring revealed the ecological disaster that comes from certain modern technologies, pesticides, through the use of them continuing without sufficient regulation. Carson's efforts helped form a counterpoint to nature as a mere convenience of the human. So I turn to what we call ecological condition, and it refers to the state of the physical, chemical, and biological characteristics of natural ecosystems and their interacting processes. Many human land use affect ecological condition through vegetation removal or alteration, stream diversion, or altered natural hydrology, introduction of non-native and invasive species, among others. So the landscape condition value data set, which is what I utilized in some contract work that I did to mitigate the risks of a Lambert compressor station going through Pennsylvania County, Virginia in 2020, was one of the parameters that I was able to use in that report to the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. And that compressor station was never built. It was 2020, not 2021. So a lot of this was contingent upon the presidential administration that would be in charge afterwards. So this is a map that I was able to use, that I utilized that data set with. And it shows the landscape condition value of the region of the Great Dismal Swamp. And the areas in white have the lowest landscape condition value, while the darkest areas have the greatest landscape value. One notices that the entire area of the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge is dark blue, indicating that the landscape condition are relatively more optimal than the ones surrounding it. And this is, of course, due to the periods when the Great Dismal Swamp was at some point extracted for timber, but there remain parts of the swamp that were untouched, largely due to the initial vastness and difficult conditions to get there. Plus, since 1972, it's been under the stewardship of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. So one of their main resource management initiatives is to restore the conditions of the swamp before it was extracted from. So once the Nature Conservancy donated the remaining areas of the Great Dismal Swamp in 1972, the Great Dismal Swamp at that point was 750 square miles. The counties bordering the Great Dismal Swamp are overwhelmingly rural and owe much of their development to agricultural interests. So the degradedness of this landscape is related to land use for monocultural farming interests. Within those counties, areas are zoned accordingly to accommodate agriculture, agriculturally related uses, and limited forms of residential development at very low densities. Corn, cotton, peanuts, soybeans, wheat, in addition to poultry farms, dominate the area in terms of agriculture and industry. Vegetables such as cabbage, sweet corn, tomatoes are also cultivated and harvested at large scales in the region. The low population of these places, at least on the North Carolina side, where Elizabeth City, North Carolina, in Pasquotank County, the population is 17,725 and is considered one of the larger cities in the eastern North Carolina region. It indicates a rurality of the region that has endured since its antebellum beginnings. The continuity of an agricultural-based economy is an indicator of how the area performs in metrics regarding poverty, employment outlooks, and segregation. In speaking with several people from the Great Dismal Swamp area, many had to leave the area to find work so that they could support themselves. The heavy emphasis on agriculture, big ag in that case, on the North Carolina side meant that the work regimes were seasonal. It also meant, depending on the crop harvested, technological advances, such as it meant limitations on the number of people needed to run machinery designed to harvest those crops. There was a trend of people in the Great Dismal Swamp region who relocated to Baltimore, Maryland, where abundant work could be found at Bethlehem Steel. It was clear from speaking to those people who grew up in the Great Dismal Swamp region that despite their love for the area and respect for its history, that the material needs of the day-to-day superseded any romantic associations to the landscape. So that's a tapestry quilt that was made by a descendant of the Great Dismal Swamp that I was able to see in August of this year. So we'll go back up to the Social Vulnerability Index. This is a data set that can be publicly assessed through ESRI's Living Atlas portion. You can also download the raw cut of it from SVI. In the SVI map, it shows the percentage of people living in poverty by county in areas bordering the Great Dismal Swamp. In the northern half, where cities and counties are in Virginia, the poverty percentages are lower due to their area being part of what is called the Hampton Roads region of Virginia. This region is known for its development sectors in aerospace, homeland defense security, and retail. The Naval Air Station known as Oceana was located in Virginia Beach. A stark contrast of economic development characterizes the border of North Carolina and Virginia with respect to the region of the Great Dismal Swamp. With the region's diverted interest in agriculture and the defense sector, there's little room for common land. The uses of the areas in the present day are dominated by commercial interest. Except for the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge, there is no place where land is held in common for the uses of everyday people. The people living in poverty in this region could benefit from common land and community investment such as that, where a site could exist where local folks could come together in a welcoming atmosphere to participate. Such spaces could contribute a more local food system that will benefit people suffering from food insecurity. A common land and place where friends and strangers become neighbors, dialoguing about more sustainable futures that depart from the monocultural operations surrounding them. Poverty in this region is linked to the afterlife of slavery. The descendants living in the region today, still surviving, thriving from the oppressive foundations that their ancestors experienced, deserve a common place where land is stewarded in lifeways of the indigenous tribes still in the area today. So a model to follow. The capital market in the Washington, D.C. area is a model for such a venture. They offer an easily accessible, welcoming space to get affordable, healthy, locally produced food, a venue for local growers, chefs, and restaurants and other food businesses to break into the market and grow their businesses, with the emphasis on businesses owned by indigenous and people of color in Prince George's County. A family-friendly event that goes beyond regular grocery shopping. Residents can shop, try new foods, build stronger relationship with neighbors, learn where their food comes from, and showcase the positive aspects of the neighborhood. A locally sourced market featuring Prince George's County-based vendors that provide hot food, cottage goods, homemade artisan crafts, and community-oriented resources at each operating day of the market. In a market where people from all backgrounds can shop, interact with each other, and feel connected to their food in a meaningful way. So the capital market was established in 2017 by three black women of the African American diaspora, led by Ashley Drakeford, who recognized the racial disparities in food deserts and rightly understood that this was part of an afterlife of enslavement. Their main objective in their initial vision for the market was to restore ownership of the local food system, to oppress communities of color through progressive policy, systemic and environmental changes. A place of communing in the Great Dismal Swamp is essential to redress the harms committed on indigenous and African descendant people who were displaced, dehumanized, and oppressed in the past. With the Great Dismal Swamp's landscape condition value is optimal, a commons within it would be rejuvenative. So if we look at this quote by Peter Linebaugh and Marcus Rediker, who are two activist historians of slavery and of capitalism, Peter says, "Yet the commons were more than a specific English agrarian practice or its American variants. The same concept underlay the clachan, the sep, the rundale, the West African village, and the indigenous tradition of long fallow agriculture of Native Americans. In other words, it encompassed all those parts of the earth that remain unprivatized, unenclosed, a non-commodity, a support for the manifold human values of mutuality." The turbulence of today's world, the impact of political instability, climate catastrophe, and the violence that materializes in human dispersals of flight and displacement is hard to ignore. This reordering of habitation results in renewed efforts by states to strengthen control over human movement. These events of human movement raise questions about the ethical policy formation in response to these journeys, and how humans who flee across territories manage the power of mobility to reach places offering safety and stability. As current policies across regions handle the infusion of human beings seeking asylum, it becomes clear that resources offered to people escaping catastrophe are limited, placing those in flight in greater dangers within new environs. In spite of the challenges involved in acts of flight, humans moving across territories in pursuit of freedom and safety have reshaped the landscapes that they've traversed into sites of social and political contests. Current worldwide debates concerning what to do about human beings crossing borders while fleeing persecution or life-threatening conditions signal the relevance of studies of human mobility. And it also tells us that the institution of racialized slavery, such dialogue has the potential to illuminate the histories of legalized discrimination, alternative ecology, and mobility, which are all entangled. Climate-induced human movement isn't new, and it has been linked for centuries to racism in a range of contexts, with environmental determinism serving as an example. Examining the human toll on what is happening on any number of borders today in response to climate disaster and institutional racism and xenophobia And if there's any way to look to the known background of these phenomena, it should be done in relation to the lived experiences of those with the most to lose. A greater understanding of the impact of landscape, navigational literacy, and human dispersals, and how these locational elements have ordered places is in order. My understanding of these spatial dimensions, because of my subjectivity as a Black person, a historical geographer, a bereaved parent, demands that I reject colonial interpretations on how spatial ordering controls the most vulnerable. As I go forth in the world, I continue to prepare to go into spaces that converge the mysteries, the possibilities, the yearnings, and the receivings of this earthbound life. My hope is that as I continue in relying on the natural world and birds to help steer my healing journey, that more remember this earth, its abundant beauty, and the inheritance we hold to sustain it even in chaotic times. And to sustain it means honoring and respecting every life on it, no matter the borders they cross. So thank you. Okay.
Excuse me, we'd like to ask if anyone has any questions about the distinguished guests. We have a microphone for your pleasure.
I do have. Is it okay? All right, so that was beautiful. How is this memorialized in place? Like, what's the honorable way for Fish and Wildlife Service to memorialize the story you just told? Is there a way to do it that is responsible so that people who are visiting the site or experiencing the landscape come to terms with what you're talking about? Or is anything, all these things are going to be prone to trouble.
Yeah.
So I don't know, what are you thinking there?
Well, currently I'm part of the Great Dismal Swamp Stakeholder Collaborative, and I'm the cultural geographer and a liaison between the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge, the Wilderness Society, and the Nature Conservancy, and several community groups which have varying interests and varying things that have happened to their individual community that makes them not always have the same agreements. And so what ends up happening is the people with the most pragmatic approaches tend to be the people who get to be in leadership. And for the refuge, I've found, at least with that particular refuge manager, he is very much open to different ways of honoring that past. A long time ago, if you were talking about the Department of the Interior, any of its agencies, whether it was the Park Service or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they didn't want to hear anything about the cultural. They didn't want to hear anything about it. And even the ones that were historic monuments, like George Carver National Monument down in Diamond, Missouri, where I used to work, they divorced George Carver from as much of his Blackness as possible. George Carver became this almost anointed being that wasn't really Black. I mean, people would come and say, he wasn't like the rest of those Blacks. Or on Martin Luther King Day, when we would screen a film about Martin Luther King and not show the usual orientation film about George Carver's life, they would say, well, why are you showing that Martin Luther King thing? I'm like, well, it's Martin Luther King Day. And they'd be like, but what did he do for Blacks? I'm just like, yeah. So it's one of those things where when you're dealing with the federal agencies, but also getting community involved, there's almost like a minefield of contested realities. But I do have hope that with this new initiative that we're doing, because we're trying to make the Great Dismal Swamp a national